problem with those of us who teach for a living is it's hard to be brief, so I'll give it my best shot. The topic I'm going to talk about is love in the Ahlul Bayt tradition, and what that has to say about finding a place in the American context. Once again, I want to thank UMAA for inviting me to speak and for letting me be on this panel. And I'd also just briefly like to say that I'm really thrilled to be on a panel with Professor Nasser, because in 1978, when I first went to graduate school, and when I still couldn't read any primary sources yet because my language skills weren't good enough, the very first seminar paper that I wrote was on the connections between the Shi'i tradition and the Sufi tradition, and this book had a tremendous influence on me. And I think that one of the things I find most remarkable is that, that's what I've still been working on for the last 25 years. So I'd like to thank you for, pointing me in that direction, sir. Let me begin by stating, as I always do, that I'm not claiming to speak as an alim, but as an ordinary believer who has spent a lot of years thinking about Islam and what it means, and teaching about Islam in the secular context of an American liberal arts college. I make no claim to expertise in issues or authority in issues of the Sharia. I will leave that entirely to the ulama. Today I want to speak about a different aspect of Islam, because I believe sincerely that we must remember that Sharia, as important as it is only one aspect of Islam. And please don't misunderstand me. I have no desire to demean the importance of Sharia as an expression of piety, but we must remember that law is part of furu and not of usul. That's the reason you can give taqlid in Sharia. But you can't give taqlid on the basic principle of recognizing the unity of God and loving the Ahlul Bayt. Now, why that's important is because I believe that as well as law, Islam is also about love, it's about mercy, and it's about compassion. And these are values that are shared with people of other faiths that allow us to find common ground and common humanity. Now, as I stated above, law is by definition one of the things that divides one religious community from another. Catholics have one way of worshiping God with certain rituals, Jews another, Muslims another, different kinds of Muslims worship God in different ways. These are the things that make us distinctive. Jews, Muslims, and Christians on the Zahiri level, by definition, are distinct traditions. But I would like to think that there are things that bind us together. While we may be divided on issues of law, fascinatingly, religious communities are remarkably similar to each other on issues of akhlaq, on what constitutes a good person, on what constitutes social justice. These are remarkably similar across religious lines. I know of no major religious tradition that teaches that murder is good, or that it's good to steal, or that you should try to sleep with your friends' and neighbors' wives or husbands, or that one should lie. Although I should point out that one of the things we have to fight consistently is this misunderstanding of taqiyya that the Islamophobes have out there. I mean, I'll go online and I'll say something that said, well, maybe you're just practicing taqiyya when you say Islam is about love. And I said, but this is out there and we have to come at it. But the fact is that taqiyya is reserved for certain kinds of things. There's no reason for Muslims to be liars, and we're not liars, we're truth tellers, and have been truth tellers. Or should be truth tellers. Not only in America, but everywhere, everybody is anti-legalistic. Notice I say anti-legalistic and not antinomian. A disciplined life rooted in reasonable and flexible rules is not a point of controversy. After all, the whole concept, as I talked about yesterday, Sharia means a way. It's a path. It's not a box. That's why ijtihad, I think, allows people to confront things and to see this not as a constraint, but as a way of thinking about the world. But inflexible ideas about rules are considered unacceptable everywhere. That's why I think the writers of the New Testament, I think we don't know if it's accurate the way they portray the Pharisees as legalistic, because we all know that someone who refuses to heal somebody who's sick because it's the Sabbath, immediately people are going to say, well, isn't there something bigger than the box? Isn't the box about something? There are so many Sufi stories to this effect, particularly in South Asia. How many stories do we know about the Malvi? How do we recognize who the Malvi is at the wedding? Look for the person with the most food on his plate, right? I was told this at a South Asian wedding. The idea about the Maulvi who's fallen in the well and nobody can get him out, and the Sufi comes, they drop down ladders and ropes, he can't get out. They hold a durham over the top, and he reaches up to grab it, and they're able to pull him out. Now, these stories don't come from Orientalists. These stories are within the tradition, and they're there to warn believers that law is good, but it's not an end in itself. One of the first lectures I ever heard on Islam was a lecture about Layla and Majnun. And one of the things I find is most genius about Islam, I one time asked Professor Qarar Hussain from Karachi, who was one of the people I learned the most from, about, where do the stories that the Sufis use to teach come from? Do they construct them themselves? He says, no, they get them from the folk, but they know how to use them to teach truth. Layla and Majnun probably existed well before anybody was a Muslim. But in the story of Layla and Majnun, which is told everywhere in the Muslim world by Sunni and Shia alike, we all know the story. Majnun is called Majnun because he saw Layla, who was, in some versions, he was a prince, he was a person of high status, and here was this goatherd girl who was unattractive, and he fell madly, passionately, insanely in love with her. He became an ashik. His father was, of course, disturbed. This was bringing disgrace upon him and his family. So he had an idea. He said, I will throw a party. And I will invite the most talented musicians to play at the party, the most talented cooks to make food at the party, and the most beautiful women from all the neighboring kingdoms. And we will make utensils at this party. We will make goblets to hold the wine that will be made by the finest craftsmen of Samarkand and Bukhara. And they will be embroidered with gold and jewels and emeralds, and there will be engravings upon them. And when he sees all of this beauty, my son will look at Layla and realize what a fool he's been. And as you all know, the day of the party comes, all of this beauty, all of these wonderful goblets from Samarkand and Bukhara, and what does Majnun do? He's in the corner mooning for Layla. And when his father becomes angry and says, my son, what is the matter with you? He picks up one of the goblets of wine and he taps it 3 times and he says, Father, the difference between you and I is that you are in love with the goblet, but I am in love with the wine. Now, all great stories have more than one way of interpreting it. And this could just be a story about how Majnun can see past the surface of Layla to see her real beauty, and that's clearly part of the story. But the person who told me this story told me there's another meaning. Those goblets made by those wonderful craftsmen, people of great skill and intellect, that is the Sharia. Why does the Sharia exist? To hold the wine of divine love. If you don't have the goblet, the wine spills all over the floor. No one has access to it. But if it's just the goblet that you see, you're missing what's important. Other awliya in South Asia talk about it another way. They say, think of the Sharia as a body. If it's not imbued with divine love and purpose, it's a corpse. But filled with love, it has meaning. This tradition, the Ahlul Bayt tradition, is rooted in love. And that's important because everybody understands love. We all want love to win out. And every tradition makes its case that it represents the true love tradition in religion. Well, almost. Yeah, what I find fascinating is that this new Ibn Taymiyyah tradition, this Wahhabi tradition, this Salafiyya tradition, it comes forward and says, Ibn Taymiyyah makes it quite clear. You can't love God. God's too abstract. We can only love His law. So that there's a distance put between the believer and the creator of the universe. And alhamdulillah, that remains a minority vision in Islam. Because our tradition is full of concepts of love. To be an ashiq, to be a murid, someone who has irada, someone who has desire. And most importantly, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa sallam is Habibullah, the beloved of God. The concept of love in Islam is intimately wrapped up with the Ahlul Bayt. And notice I'm using the term Ahlul Bayt tradition because it's my experience that the Ahlul Bayt tradition is not limited to Isna Ashari Shi'ism. One day, many years ago, I went to the tomb of Pir Shams in Multan. A very interesting shrine because the Ismailis claim that it's the tomb of one of the members of their dawah, and other people claim it that this was a Shia saint, and other people claim it as a Sunni saint. And one day there was a dervish who had come, clad all in black. He was giving a majlis. And I sat and I watched the majlis with some young men. And afterwards they said, let's have tea. So we went to have tea, and I assumed that they were Shia. It was a Shia majlis. They said, no, we're Sunnis. But like most Sunnis in Pakistan, we love the Ahlul Bayt. We are believers. The only people that they said that we consider not believers are the Wahhabis because they do not love the Ahlul Bayt as part of their Islam. I've never traveled anywhere in the Muslim world where most Sunnis have not at some time said, Ya Ali Madad. And they would mostly admit that no one has ever said, Ya Abu Bakr Madad. Because despite the fact that the texts want to tell you that the Khalifas are arranged in order of their excellence, throughout the popular vision of the Islamic world, Hazrat Ali Shah Aliyah Amir al-Mu'mineen is seen as someone special, someone with a unique relationship with God and the Prophet. In the Muslim world, love for the Ahlul Bayt tends to link Sunni and Shia because this love tradition is so linked to the Ahlul Bayt. One of the first things I was told when I went to Pakistan for the first time by a member of the Shia community, he says, you have to understand what our tradition is all about. Just an ordinary person, but such a beautiful thing, he said. As Muslims, we are commanded to love God. We should all love God. But how do we love God? Well, how do you love anyone? You love them whom God loves most. And who does God love most? His Habibullah, the Prophet Muhammad, for whom he created the world so that he would have a place to be. And whom did the Prophet, how do you love the Prophet? By loving those whom the Prophet loved most. And who did the Prophet love most in all the world? But Fatima, his daughter, and his son-in-law and Mawla, Ali ibn Abu Talib, and his grandsons, Hassan and Hussein, who used to climb on his back when he was saying prayers. To be a Muslim is to love God and love those whom God loved. And one of the reasons for that is that the Islamic tradition holds that where do we see God? We see God reflected in the hearts of his awliya, of his friends. And who more are his friends than Muhammad and the Ahlul Bayt? Even Hindus in Lucknow go to Muharram because they see something special in Imam Hussein. And even in Sunni places, one day I was in Egypt at the tomb of what the Fatimids claim was the tomb of Zain al-Abidin, and it was a day of Inshad, which is Arabic Qawwali. And the Munshid, this huge crowd of people, and people were going into Vajd, and at one point the Munshid started singing, Ya Rasul min Nurullah, Ali min Nurullah. This is in Egypt. This is among Sunnis. That Ali is from the light of God. And the people next to me, they saw I had a camera, and I thought, they touched the camera. I thought they were going to say, don't take pictures. I went with the camera. I said, no, we want you to take pictures. We want you to show people in America how much we love God. This is the side of Islam people don't see. Because we get the notion that Islam is this Wahhabi guy with the big orange beard who everything is that you do this, you don't do that, you do this, you don't do that. There is no love, there is no devotion, there's no passion, there's no light. But when people see this, they go, this is a vision of Islam I didn't have. What is this thing? Why are Muslims full of love? Now, don't misunderstand me. I am not calling for a kind of new age denuding of Islam into an amorphous mysticism. There's nothing I dislike more than the Coleman Barks third-rate translations of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi that reduce his genius into amorphous and acontextual claptrap by removing all the references to Muhammad and to Ali and to the God of Islam that at the center of the meaning of the Masnavi. And the same with attempts to turn the Turkish mystic Yunus Emre into a modern secular humanist. However, it is this shared mystical humanism rooted in divine love that provides a common set of beliefs and values which allows Islam to speak beyond its ritual boundaries and speak to those of other faiths. In fact, that's how the Aliyah converted people to Islam. We have endless stories of dervishes who went to a Hindu village and they fasted and they prayed and they worked miracles and they solved problems, and people said, I want to be like this good person. What does he believe? That's how Islam spread. That's how Islam spread in Central Asia. These stories of holy persons who were seen as holy by people in other traditions, because that notion of what is holy is rooted in that common insaniyat, and this is my own belief, and I hope I'm not wrong in it, that came when God made Adam from clay and put his ruh into him, and asked the angels to bow before that, because we accepted the world as an amanat and took upon ourselves the responsibility of being human beings. Humanism is not a bad word. Humanism in this sense is at the core of Islam, because human beings, the children of Adam, are the Khalifas of God. Now, let us turn to America for a second, because that's been the theme of the conference. Those who fear and loathe Islam wish to reduce Islam to its legal aspects. The Robert Spencers of the world portray Muslims as mindless robots, adhering to the Sharia not as a complex and living system providing guidance, but as a rigid and unfeeling set of rules. Once one becomes a Muslim, one stops thinking and one stops feeling. If Muslims are understood not as Sharia-minded, as Marshall Hodgson describes it, but instead as legalistic, they will be seen by others as inferior and inhumane. The more Muslims can be shown to be not part of us by virtue of having different rituals and choosing to dress differently, the easier it is to push them aside as perpetual aliens in America. Muslims, these people argue, the Islamophobes argue, do not worship a God of love and mercy, despite the fact that the surahs of the Quran consistently begin by confirming that God is both merciful and compassionate. For them, they argue that God of Islam is only a lawgiver. They may quote the throne verse and see God in his transcendent power, but they never understand that for Muslims, God is also nearer than our jugular vein. And they never understand what the Turkish Muslims call God, dost, the friend. We need to demonstrate that for us, and by the way, part of what this does is it reduces the Prophet ﷺ to a telephone receiver. If all the Prophet did was reveal the Quran, the words of the Quran, if he was not also a walking tafsir, if he was not, it's not only Quran and Hadith that are the sources. It's the lives of the awliyaullah. And the Prophet and Ali are the center of that. Now, the alienation of Islam in America, on the basis of its supposed legalism and ritualism, has analogies with other religious prejudices in America's past. For example, anti-Catholicism has a long history in America and manifested itself in vicious anti-immigrant attitudes towards the Irish and the Italians. This was almost always entirely justified by the false notion that the religions of Catholics, unlike Protestant, was rooted in ritual rather than ethics. And the fact that the Catholics could never be loyal to America because they were followers of the Pope and the minions of the priests and nuns. At the 19th century, there were ex-Catholics who traveled around the country telling their stories of how they escaped from Catholic institutions, warning Protestants about the evils of Catholicism. In the same way, we have the Wafat Sultans and the Ayan Hirsi Alis in our own time who have become professional ex-Muslims, going around and saying, you've never met these people, but they are all evil and we have to, be afraid of them and stand aside. We need to counter that by demonstrating that Islam is more than what they're saying it is, that it's different than what they're saying it is. Similarly, Jews have been portrayed as ritualistic and pharisaical, tied to their rabbis and arcane laws. And in fact, in the 19th century, many Americans believed Jews had tails. It's interesting, the same heinous lies come out. Most importantly, they were portrayed as followers of a God of laws rather than the God of love, which the Christians said, that's the God of the New Testament. Now, in both cases, in terms of Catholicism and Judaism, this vision is just wrong. The God of the Torah is, in fact, sometimes portrayed as a lawgiver and a God of justice, just as the God in the Quran is portrayed sometimes that way, but the God in the Torah is also portrayed as the merciful God of love. And if you look at what Jesus actually says, he doesn't say much original. He quotes things about God's mercy from the Hebrew Bible. Similarly, Catholicism is not simply about ritual, and it's not about blind obedience to the Pope. After all, papal infallibility is a limited concept that only appeared in the 19th century. The good news is that both Catholics and Jews have now been integrated and into the American experience and are seen by Americans as people who belong here. We need to explain why. Because now Americans realize that Jews and Catholics value love, that their rituals exist not as ends in themselves, but rather as vessels for the spiritual edification of their believers. We need to explain to non-Muslims our own love traditions. It is a common language that allows us to make connection with like-minded Jews and Christians. But we should also do this to remind ourselves of the depths of our own traditions. Now, how do I know this? First of all, I teach at a college that unfortunately has very few Muslim students. And I would like to reach out to some of the young people here. We've just started a new program, a concentration in Islamic civilization and cultures at Kenyon College, where we try to teach the humanities of the Islamic world and using the same methods that we would teach the humanities of Europe. And please apply, come, see what we're about. I think you might find it interesting. Now, in my introductory religion class, the last text we read in the year is Attar's Conference of the Birds, the translation by Dick Davis. It speaks to them. I had one Jewish student tell me, if I wasn't so committed to Judaism, I'd want to be a Sufi Muslim. And I teach Sufism as Islam, not as some New Age hippie thing. Similarly, we read in my Sufism seminar Javed Majadidi's translation of the Masnavi with more advanced students, and they are stunned, and they walk away really impressed by the depth of Islam. But in the end, it is most importantly, every year, the narrative of Imam Hussein that most fully reaches my students. When I tell the story of Karbala to my students, they almost invariably sit in rapt attention. Not because I'm a great speaker, but because the story is so inherently compelling that it grips them at a deep and profound level. How that same Imam Hussein, who as a child climbed on the back of his grandfather, was now killed at the hands of the minions of Yazid ibn Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, a man who claimed to represent the polity of Islam. How Zainab stood courageously before Yazid to bear witness to that tragedy and to that crime. Here is love. Love for God, love for humanity, expressed not in simple univocal terms, but in all of its mystery, complexity, and multivocality. Suddenly Islam is no longer some legalistic religion, but a profound spiritual world, a world worth knowing, a world that my students, inshallah, want to keep knowing. We need to share that world. Let me end with one final anecdote. A few years ago, the conservatives on my campus invited Irshad Manji to give a talk. At the dinner, she asked me what I had been doing before I came to the dinner, and I said that I'd just been on a panel, because this was the year that the Passion of the Christ came out, the film, and we had a panel, and I was on that panel. I said, what were you doing on the panel? I said, I was talking about passions in Islam. In particularly, I was talking about the passion narratives of Mansur al-Hallaj and Imam Hussein. Her response was both curious and telling. She wondered why Muslims, who should, after all, know that Islam is about pure monotheism and doesn't believe in the veneration of human beings, still cling to this shirk about venerating persons. And I responded to her, it's kind of weird that someone who goes around the country screaming about Islamic fundamentalism holds the same theological understanding of Islam as the Salafiyya and the Wahhabis. Suffice it to say, as I pressed her, it became that Irshad Manji, whose books sell a lot more than those of us who write books on Islam in this room, knew nothing about the Islamic tradition. She knew nothing of the Sufis. She knew nothing of Shiism. She knew nothing of the Ahlul Bayt. And by the way, she couldn't read any Islamic language. The best-selling author of The Problem with Islam, who gets paid lots of money to go to college campuses and talk about Islam, knew nothing about Islam other than what she read in the New York Times or saw on CNN or Fox News. This allowed her to caricature Islam, stereotype it, and demean it. And most sadly, The Muslim women from my Sufism seminar who went to hear her talk felt completely alienated by it, because after her talk, people will go and say, well, isn't this the truth? But that's not my experience of Islam. And they felt like they had to defend themselves against this person who had, sort of escaped from Islam and was telling them the dark underworld stories of it. When we tell the story of how Islam is a religion of love and compassion and mercy and sacrifice, this can do more to counter the Irshad Manjis of the world than anything else we can do. We know better. We know that Islam is a religion of love, not a cute Hallmark card version of love, but a profound and life-changing love. The love that led Hallaj to the gallows and Imam Hussein to Karbala. That is the language we can use to speak to non-Muslims and find common ground and find our place among the religions in the American context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Vernon Schubel, for your very impassioned point of view, and I think you have been able to